A tyrannical HOA president just kicked down my door at 8 a.m., demanding I sell my family's cabin. She'd already destroyed 3 neighbors. But today, she picked the wrong victim at the worst possible moment. Because when she stormed in screaming, I was live on camera with the one person who could dismantle her entire corrupt empire. This is how one recorded confrontation exposed a $2.3 million fraud and changed HOA laws forever. Where are you all watching this story from? I thought this important meeting could protect my cabin, but I never imagined it would protect me like this. Let me tell you how we got here. Because this story is about more than just a crazy HOA president losing her mind. It's about what happens when someone who's used to bullying defenseless people finally picks the wrong target at the absolute worst possible moment for her and the absolute best possible moment for justice. My name is Mason Reed, and I'm a 34-year-old freelance software engineer who inherited this beautiful cabin from my grandfather 3 years ago. The cabin sits on a piece of land that's been in my family for over 60 years, completely outside the boundaries of the Pinewood Estates HOA that Karen Whitmore rules with an iron fist. But legal boundaries have never stopped Karen before, and they sure as hell weren't going to stop her today. The smell of pine walls my grandfather sanded by hand, the crackle of his fireplace recordings I still played at night, it was all about to be stolen. Karen wasn't just after property, she was erasing my last connection to him. She'd made it her personal mission to extend her authority wherever she pleased, turning the entire neighborhood into her kingdom of petty tyranny and manufactured violations. Sitting in my cabin that morning with my steaming coffee mug, I was surrounded by reminders of my grandfather's legacy. Framed photos showed him building this place with his own hands, teaching me carpentry during summer visits, sharing stories by the fireplace about standing up to bullies and doing what's right even when it's hard. The wooden desk where my laptop sat was one of his masterpieces. Every joint perfectly fitted, every surface lovingly sanded smooth. This wasn't just property to me. It was the repository of my childhood memories and the foundation of who I'd become. The worry gnawing at me wasn't just about Karen's harassment. It was about the timing. Today's video call was potentially life-changing. A technical assessment for a major consulting contract with the state government. I'd been working toward this opportunity for months, and now Karen was threatening to destroy it with her theatrical breakdown outside my door. If she disrupts this meeting, I thought, staring at the professional backdrop behind Patricia on my screen, the whole project goes down the drain. But I had no idea that Karen's timing would turn out to be the worst possible mistake of her entire career. Karen's escalating demands outside my door grew more unhinged by the minute. Open the damn door. I know you're in there, Mason Reed. Don't think you can hide from a proper HOA inspection. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was creating more noise than I'd made in the past month combined while claiming to investigate noise violations. She was asserting authority she didn't possess over property she didn't control. The Martinez family's gnome? I whispered to Patricia's recording. Karen fined them $500 a day until they sold to her cousin, at half value. Through the window, I could see her circling the cabin like a predator, taking photos of everything she could see, building her case for violations that existed only in her imagination. Karen's violations were always lies. The Johnson's mailbox crime? It was beige. Patricia Hayes, the voice on my laptop screen, spoke with the kind of measured authority that comes from years in high-level government service. Her tone was crisp and professional, entirely unaware that my immediate future was being threatened by a woman who treated property law like a personal suggestion. Mason, we should begin the technical assessment portion of your interview. Are you ready to proceed with the security clearance verification? I tried to keep my voice steady, not wanting to sabotage this opportunity I'd worked so hard to secure. I'm ready, Miss Hayes. Just dealing with a minor neighbor situation. That's when Karen escalated to her next level of crazy, and my blood ran cold. She pulled out what looked like a full set of keys, and among them was one that looked identical to my cabin key, down to the distinctive worn edge where Grandpa had filed it to fit the old lock better. How the hell did she get a copy of my key? The implications hit me like a freight train. She'd been planning this invasion for who knows how long. Probably casing my property, studying my routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. How she got my grandpa's filed key? I'd find out later. It involved a bribed locksmith. Patricia's voice came through my headphones with a slight edge of professional concern. Is everything all right over there, Mason? I'm hearing some kind of disturbance, and for security purposes, I need to know if there's any threat to the integrity of this assessment. I made a split-second decision that would change everything. Instead of minimizing the situation, I decided to be completely honest. Miss Hayes, there's an HOA president outside who's claiming authority over my property, which is completely outside her jurisdiction. She appears to have somehow obtained a copy of my key and is threatening to enter my home. The silence on the other end of the call lasted exactly 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When Patricia spoke again, her voice had shifted into something I didn't recognize at first, something colder and more dangerous. Mason, I need you to keep this call active and do not hang up under any circumstances. What you're describing may constitute several federal violations, and I want everything documented. Patricia's voice cut through my headphones, deadly calm. Mason, let her speak. Every word is federal evidence. I realized then Karen wasn't trapping me. She was confessing. That's when I realized that Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her life, and she didn't even know it yet. 30 seconds, or I'm calling the police. Karen waved her phone in the air like a weapon, completely unaware that the person listening to every word she screamed had the authority to investigate every HOA in the entire state. As I watched her prepare for what she thought would be another easy victory over a helpless homeowner, I had no idea that this morning would become the beginning of the end for her reign of terror. The beautiful irony was that Karen thought she was hunting prey, but she was about to become the star of her federal investigation. I looked at my laptop screen where Patricia was typing a message in the chat. Keep the call open. I need to hear this. I switched on the recording function and tried to keep my composure, but my heart was hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. This was supposed to be the most important professional call of my career, and instead it was turning into a live documentary of HOA abuse. Karen had moved from pounding on the front door to circling my cabin like a shark that smelled blood in the water. I could see her through different windows as she systematically tested every possible entry point, taking photos with her phone and muttering to herself like she was conducting some kind of official investigation. What the hell is she doing? I whispered into my microphone. Patricia's response came back immediately, and there was something almost amused in her professional tone. Providing evidence. Mason, just keep everything recorded. That's when Karen found what she was looking for. The bathroom window on the side of the cabin had a latch that never quite closed properly. Something Grandpa had always meant to fix, but never got around to. I watched in absolute disbelief as this 52-year-old woman in a business suit started climbing through my bathroom window like some kind of deranged cat burglar. The sight was so absurd that I almost laughed except for the fact that she was breaking into my home while I was on a federal call. Are you seeing this? I asked Patricia, angling my laptop so the camera could catch Karen's legs disappearing through the window. The next 30 seconds felt like they lasted an hour. I could hear Karen moving through my cabin, her heels clicking on the hardwood floors as she made her way toward my office. She was muttering to herself, practicing what sounded like accusations and violations. She was planning to cite me for unauthorized business operations, excessive electronic equipment, failure to maintain proper residential standards. It was like listening to someone rehearse their lines for a very bad play, except this play was about to ruin my life if I didn't handle it perfectly. Then my office door burst open and Karen stood there like she'd just solved the crime of the century. Got you. I knew it. I caught you red-handed. Her manicured hand slammed onto Grandpa's workbench, the one where he taught me to fight bullies. This isn't HOA property. I spat. Patricia's mic picked up my knuckles cracking. Her face was flushed with triumph and what looked suspiciously like the thrill of finally having someone at her mercy. She pointed at my laptop setup like she'd discovered a meth lab instead of a simple home office. You're running an illegal business operation in a residential zone, and I have every right to shut this down immediately. I managed to keep my voice calm and level, which in retrospect was probably the most impressive thing I did that entire morning. Good morning, Karen. As you can see, I'm currently in a meeting with the state government. Would you like to explain to them how you just entered my property without permission? The look on her face was priceless. For about 2 seconds, doubt flickered across her features, like maybe she'd miscalculated something important. But Karen Whitmore had built her entire identity on never backing down, no matter how wrong she was. Don't try to intimidate me with your fake important calls, she snapped, moving closer to my desk. I don't care if you're pretending to talk to the president himself. This is an HOA matter, and I have full authority to investigate violations. That's when Patricia decided to make her presence known, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop about 10 degrees. Excuse me, came Patricia's voice through my laptop speakers, crisp and unmistakably authoritative. This is Attorney General Patricia Hayes. Could you please identify yourself and explain your legal basis for entering this property? The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my heartbeat. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. For the first time since I'd known her, Karen Whitmore was completely speechless. But Karen's recovery time was faster than I'd expected. After about 5 seconds of stunned silence, she let out a laugh that sounded more like a bark. Yeah, right. And I'm the Queen of England. She waved her hand dismissively at my laptop screen. Nice try with the fake authority figure, but I've seen every scam in the book. You probably have some friend pretending to be important to try to scare me off. That's when Patricia did something that made my jaw drop. The video call interface suddenly changed and Patricia turned on her camera for the first time since our call began. The background behind her wasn't just professional. It was unmistakably official. I could see the state seal on the wall behind her, official certificates and awards, and what looked like the kind of office that only very important government officials get to occupy. Miss Whitmore, Patricia said, and her voice had shifted into something that could freeze hell itself. You are currently being recorded for official state investigative purposes. I strongly suggest you reconsider your next actions. Karen stared at the screen for a long moment, and I watched her brain trying to process what she was seeing. The official backdrop, the government seals, and the woman who looked exactly like someone who could have an entire HOA board investigated and dissolved. But Karen had spent so many years believing her hype that she couldn't accept the possibility that she'd finally met someone with more authority than she had. This is still fake, she declared. But her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Deepfakes are everywhere now. You can make anyone look like anything on a computer screen. She started moving toward my laptop with obvious intent. I'm shutting this scam down right now, and then we're going to have a real conversation about your violations. That's when I realized Karen was about to make the biggest mistake of her entire life. She was reaching for my laptop completely unaware that Patricia had just switched the call to official state recording mode, and everything Karen did from this point forward would have permanent legal consequences. I could see the red recording indicator flashing on my screen, and I knew that whatever happened next was going to change everything for both of us. Karen reached for my laptop with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for her actions. Completely oblivious to the red, official state recording in progress banner that had just appeared across my screen, Patricia's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Miss Whitmore, you are now being recorded for official state investigation purposes. Every word and action from this point forward will be documented as evidence. I watched Karen's hand freeze halfway to my keyboard as the implications slowly sank in, but her pride was too strong to let her back down now. I don't care what kind of recording you think you're doing, Karen snapped, but I could hear the first cracks in her armor of absolute certainty. I have every right to shut down illegal business operations in my jurisdiction. She lunged for my laptop again, and I instinctively moved to block her, protecting not just my equipment, but what was rapidly becoming the most important legal documentation of my life. The irony was beautiful. Karen's aggression was providing Patricia with a real-time case study in HA abuse of power, and she was too blinded by her own authority complex to realize it. That's when Karen revealed just how deep her surveillance of my property had gone, and the violation of privacy was even worse than I'd imagined. She pulled out a small digital device that looked like a professional sound meter, the kind used by actual noise pollution investigators. I've been monitoring the decibel levels from your property for weeks, she announced with the pride of someone who thought she'd just revealed a smoking gun. This device shows consistent violations of our community quiet standards, and I have documentation going back 2 months. The problem with Karen's evidence was that my cabin wasn't part of her community, and she had no legal right to monitor anything I did. But Karen wasn't done with her revelations. From her oversized purse, she produced a small video camera that looked like it belonged in a spy movie. I've also been recording suspicious activity around your property, she said, waving the device like it was a badge of honor instead of evidence of stalking. This footage shows vehicles coming and going at all hours. Clear proof of unauthorized commercial activity. Patricia's voice came through my speakers with what I was beginning to recognize as barely controlled professional outrage. Miss Whitmore, are you admitting to conducting surveillance of a private citizen without legal authority or consent? The question seemed to catch Karen off guard, like she'd never considered that her investigation might be illegal. I'm protecting the integrity of our community, she protested. But her voice had lost its earlier conviction. Property owners have a right to ensure their neighbors aren't violating zoning laws or community standards. That's when I decided to reveal my preparation for exactly this kind of encounter, and Karen's face went white as I pulled out my phone. Speaking of recordings, I said, opening my security app with deliberate slowness. I should probably mention that I installed a comprehensive camera system around my cabin about 6 months ago. Karen's confident expression crumbled as I turned my phone screen toward her, showing multiple camera angles of my property. These cameras have been recording everything, including your rather creative entry through my bathroom window about 10 minutes ago. The footage was crystal clear. Karen circling my cabin, testing windows and doors, and finally climbing through the bathroom window like a common burglar. Patricia's response was immediate and professionally devastating. Mason, please upload that footage to the Secure State Evidence portal immediately. Miss Whitmore, you've just provided documentation of criminal trespassing, breaking and entering, and potentially stalking charges. I watched Karen's face cycle through a range of emotions. Confusion, anger, fear, and finally a desperate kind of defiance that told me she was about to make things even worse for herself. You can't use those recordings, Karen declared, as if she could simply will away evidence of her crimes. I was conducting official HOA business. I have immunity for enforcement actions. The legal ignorance in that statement was staggering, but it perfectly captured Karen's fundamental misunderstanding of how authority works. She'd spent so long bullying people who couldn't fight back that she'd forgotten there were limits to her power and consequences for exceeding them. That's when Patricia delivered what I would later think of as the first nail in Karen's legal coffin. Miss Whitmore, there is no such thing as HOA immunity for criminal activity. Breaking and entering is a felony regardless of your claimed motivation, and surveillance, without consent, is a violation of federal privacy laws. The color drained from Karen's face as she realized that her official investigation was a criminal enterprise that she'd been documenting herself. But Karen still had one more card to play, and it revealed just how calculating her harassment campaign had been. You don't understand, she said, her voice taking on a desperate edge. This property is affecting our entire community's property values. If I don't enforce standards here, the whole neighborhood will suffer. For the first time, I heard something that sounded almost like genuine emotion in her voice. But it was too little, too late to save her from the legal avalanche she'd triggered. The room fell silent as we all processed what had just happened. Karen had essentially confessed to multiple crimes while being recorded by the state's top law enforcement official, all in the name of protecting property values that weren't threatened by anything I was doing. Patricia's voice cut through the silence with surgical precision. Miss Whitmore, I strongly advise you to remain silent and contact an attorney immediately. You are in serious legal jeopardy. But Karen couldn't help herself. This is ridiculous, she shouted, waving her hands frantically. I'm the victim here. He's the one violating community standards. That's when we all heard the sound that would change everything. The distant wail of police sirens getting closer to my cabin, and Karen's smile of triumph told me she thought her cavalry was finally arriving to save her. The police sirens grew louder, and Karen's triumphant smile spread across her face like she'd just won the lottery. "My backup is here," she declared, straightening her jacket and preparing to play the role of the wronged authority figure. "Officers, I called you about a trespassing situation and illegal business operations." But as the sound got closer, I recognized something familiar about the particular pattern of that siren, and a smile started tugging at the corners of my mouth. That wasn't just any police vehicle. It was Marcus Chen's patrol car, and Marcus had been my best friend since high school. Deputy Marcus Chen knocked on my front door with the professional courtesy that Karen had completely ignored. And when she rushed to answer it with obvious relief, she was already launching into her rehearsed victim narrative. "Officer, thank God you're here. I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Pinewood Estates HOA, and I've apprehended this man conducting illegal business operations in a residential zone." Marcus looked around my cabin with the careful attention of someone who understood property law, taking in the clear boundaries and the obvious separation from any HOA-controlled area. "Ma'am, I need to clarify something," Marcus said in his calm, professional voice. "We received a call about a breaking and entering incident, not about business violations. Can you tell me who reported the illegal business activities you're referring to?" Karen's confident expression flickered for just a moment as she realized the police weren't here because of her call. I reported multiple violations. "Who else would have called you?" That's when Marcus delivered the first blow to Karen's rapidly crumbling narrative. "Ma'am, we received the call from a Mrs. Rodriguez next door. She reported seeing someone climbing through a window into this property about 20 minutes ago." Marcus turned to look directly at Karen, and his professional demeanor shifted into something more serious. "She said the person was a middle-aged woman in a business suit who appeared to be breaking into the cabin while the owner was home." The color drained from Karen's face as she realized her rescue was actually her worst nightmare coming true. That's when Marcus and I had one of those moments that only come from years of friendship where entire conversations happened with just a look. "Hey, Mason," he said with the warmth of someone who'd known me since we were teenagers getting into trouble together. "Fancy seeing you here. Are you having some kind of property dispute?" The casual tone of his greeting made it clear to everyone in the room that I wasn't some random suspect. I was someone Marcus knew and trusted, which immediately shifted the entire dynamic of the situation. Patricia's voice came through my laptop speakers at exactly the right moment, adding another layer of authority that Karen wasn't prepared for. "Deputy Chin, this is Attorney General Patricia Hayes. I've been monitoring this situation through an official state call with Mr. Reed, and I can confirm that Miss Whitmore has committed several serious violations that require immediate attention." Marcus straightened up immediately, recognizing both the title and the voice from state law enforcement briefings he'd attended. "Yes, ma'am." "Attorney General Hayes," Marcus replied. "I recognize your voice from the state briefings on HOA abuse cases. I'll need to take statements from everyone involved and document any evidence of criminal activity." And I watched Karen's last hope for controlling this narrative die a quick and painful death. That's when Karen made her next desperate move, pulling out what she claimed was her legal justification for everything she'd done. From her purse, Karen produced a document that looked official enough to fool someone who didn't look too closely. "I have full authorization from the HOA board to conduct inspections and enforce community standards," she announced, waving the paper like it was a get-out-of-jail-free card. "This gives me the legal right to enter any property that affects community welfare." Marcus took the document and examined it with the careful attention of someone who'd seen plenty of fake authorizations in his career. "Ma'am, this signature doesn't match our database records for HOA officials," Marcus said after less than 30 seconds of examination, and even if it were legitimate. "No HOA has the authority to override property rights or conduct warrantless searches of private homes." Karen's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious, cycling from confusion to anger to desperate defiance. That's when I realized just how deep Karen's delusions about her authority went. "But I'm the HOA president," she protested, as if that title somehow granted her powers that superseded actual law enforcement. "I have a responsibility to protect property values and community standards." This man is running a business out of his home in violation of our residential zoning requirements. Marcus looked at her with the patience of someone who dealt with plenty of people who fundamentally misunderstood how authority works. Ma'am, first of all, this property appears to be outside your HOA boundaries entirely, Marcus explained, checking his tablet for the official property records. Second, even if it weren't, HOA authority doesn't extend to criminal law enforcement or property searches. And third, you've just admitted to entering someone's home without permission, which is a felony regardless of your claimed justification. The legal education Marcus was providing seemed to bounce right off Karen's armor of willful ignorance. But the most devastating moment came when Marcus asked the question that revealed just how calculated Karen's campaign against me had been. Miss Whitmore, can you explain why you were specifically targeting this property when it's clearly outside your jurisdiction? Karen's answer revealed more than she probably intended. Because his property affects our entire community. If we don't maintain standards everywhere, property values will plummet and our whole investment will be worthless. Miss Whitmore, I need you to step outside while I take Mr. Reed's statement, Marcus said, with the kind of professional firmness that doesn't leave room for argument. Based on what I've observed and the evidence presented, you may be facing charges for breaking and entering, trespassing, and harassment. That's when my phone rang with another call that would completely change the trajectory of this entire situation. The caller ID showed Grandpa's lawyer, urgent, and my heart skipped a beat. Mr. Harrison only called when something major was happening with the estate, and his timing couldn't have been more perfect or more ominous for everyone involved. Excuse me, Deputy Chen. Miss Hayes, I said, putting the call on speaker so everyone could hear. This might be relevant to the situation. Marcus nodded his approval while Patricia leaned forward with obvious professional interest, and Karen looked like she was watching her last hope for control slip away. Mason, I'm calling with urgent news about your grandfather's estate. Mr. Harrison's voice crackled through the phone speaker with the gravity of someone who'd been practicing law for 40 years. I've been going through some additional documents that were recently discovered in your grandfather's safety deposit box. Documents that significantly changed the legal status of your property. The anticipation in the room was palpable as everyone waited for information that could reshape everything we thought we knew about this conflict. I need you to understand the full scope of what your grandfather left you, Mr. Harrison continued, and I could hear papers rustling in the background as he consulted his files. The land surveys and deed records I've just reviewed indicate that your inherited property is substantially larger than we initially calculated. The boundaries extend approximately 200 yards further south and east than the original assessment showed. My mouth went dry as I started to understand the implications of what he was telling me, and I glanced at Karen to see her face growing paler by the second. Mr. Harrison's voice took on the tone of someone delivering news that would fundamentally alter lives. Mason, according to these newly discovered surveys, your property includes approximately 40% of what is currently known as Pinewood Estates HOA territory. The land that Miss Whitmore has been managing as HOA property for the past 5 years legally belongs to you and has belonged to your family for over 60 years. The silence that followed this revelation was so complete I could hear my heartbeat echoing in my ears. Patricia was the first to break the stunned silence, her voice sharp with professional interest and barely contained excitement. Mr. Harrison, are you saying that Miss Whitmore has been operating an HOA on property that she has no legal authority over? The implications were staggering, not just for Karen personally, but for every decision she'd made, every fine she'd levied, every family she'd driven out of homes that were technically on my land all along. That's exactly what I'm saying, Mr. Harrison replied with the confidence of someone who'd spent the morning verifying facts that would destroy reputations and possibly lead to criminal charges. And there's more. I've discovered email communications from 2 years ago indicating that Miss Whitmore was made aware of these boundary discrepancies by the county surveyor's office. Rather than address the issue legally, it appears she chose to suppress the information and continue operating as if she had legitimate authority. Karen's reaction was immediate and desperate, the kind of panic response that comes from watching your entire world collapse in real time. That's impossible, she shrieked, but her voice cracked with the strain of trying to maintain a lie that was crumbling around her. I've invested my family's entire savings into HOA improvements and property management. We've spent everything we had on maintaining community standards. For the first time since I'd known her, Karen sounded genuinely human, genuinely terrified, and genuinely aware that she was facing financial and legal ruin. Marcus stepped forward with his notebook out, his training kicking in as he recognized that this was no longer just a simple trespassing case. Miss Whitmore, are you admitting that you knowingly continued to operate an HOA on property you knew you had no legal authority over? The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall, and Karen's response would determine whether she was facing civil liability or criminal fraud charges. I didn't know, Karen protested, but her voice lacked conviction even to her ears. The surveyor's office sends so many documents. I can't be expected to understand every technical detail. It was exactly the kind of excuse that might work in a civil case, but would never hold up under criminal investigation, especially with Patricia Hayes listening to every word and taking mental notes for what was going to become a major case study in HOA corruption. That's when Mr. Harrison delivered the information that would transform me from victim to plaintiff in what was about to become a very expensive lawsuit. Mason, based on these property records, you have legal grounds to seek damages for unauthorized use of your land, fraudulent management fees collected from residents living on your property, and potentially criminal charges for the suppression of public records. The words hit the room like a bomb, and I watched Karen sink into my grandfather's old chair like her legs couldn't support her anymore. But the most devastating revelation was still coming, and it would explain everything about Karen's increasingly desperate behavior over the past year. There's one more thing you need to know, Mr. Harrison continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone about to reveal the final piece of a very ugly puzzle. The financial records I've reviewed suggest that Miss Whitmore has been using HOA funds collected from residents on your property to cover personal debts and family expenses. We're looking at potential embezzlement charges in addition to fraud and unauthorized property management. The room fell into a silence so profound it felt like the entire world had stopped breathing. Karen sat slumped in the chair, her face buried in her hands as the full scope of her legal and financial exposure became clear to everyone present. She wasn't just facing the loss of her HOA position. She was facing federal charges, civil lawsuits, and the destruction of everything she'd spent years building through intimidation and illegal authority. Patricia's voice cut through the silence with surgical precision. Miss Whitmore, given what we've just learned, I'm recommending that Deputy Chin place you under arrest immediately. You're facing federal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and violation of civil rights under color of authority. Karen looked up from her hands with the expression of someone who finally understood that her reign of terror was over. But she still had one last desperate card to play. Wait. Karen suddenly straightened up, reaching into her purse with the frantic energy of someone grasping for their final lifeline. I have evidence that will change everything. You don't understand what you're dealing with. She pulled out a USB drive with shaking hands, and the look in her eyes told me that whatever was on that device, she believed it would save her from the legal avalanche that was about to bury her completely. Karen thrust the USB at Marcus. Play it. You'll see he's the criminal. Patricia's laugh was ice. Miss Whitmore, that's our forensic copy. Your embezzlement logs are on page 4. Karen gripped the USB drive like it was the last life preserver on a sinking ship, her hands trembling with the desperate energy of someone who had finally realized the full scope of her predicament. This contains everything you need to know about Mason Reed, she declared, waving the device in the air with what remained of her shattered confidence. I have documented evidence of his illegal activities, his attempts to bribe local officials, and proof that he's been planning to destroy our community from the beginning. The desperation in her voice was so thick, you could practically taste it. But what she didn't realize was that she was about to hand us the final piece of evidence needed to destroy her completely. Patricia's voice came through my laptop speakers with the cold precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Miss Whitmore, before you continue, I need to inform you that this call has now been elevated to an official federal investigation. Everything you say and do from this point forward will be documented as evidence in a criminal case. The red recording indicator on my screen seemed to pulse brighter as if the technology itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold in my grandfather's cabin. "I don't care about your fake investigation," Karen shrieked. But the crack in her voice betrayed the fear she was trying so hard to hide. "My family will lose everything if this HOA fails. Do you understand what that means? I've put our entire life savings into community improvements, maintenance contracts, and property management systems." For the first time since this nightmare began, I heard something approaching genuine human emotion in Karen's voice. The sound of someone watching their world collapse in real time. But Karen's emotional breakdown quickly gave way to something far more dangerous. The cornered animal response of someone with nothing left to lose. "I've been monitoring Mason's activities for months," she admitted, apparently unaware that she was confessing to multiple federal crimes. "I have recordings of his phone calls, copies of his emails, and documentation of every suspicious vehicle that's visited this property." Marcus stepped forward immediately, his hand moving instinctively toward his handcuffs as Karen essentially confessed to stalking, wiretapping, and electronic surveillance violations. "Miss Whitmore," Marcus said, with the firm authority of someone who had heard enough confessions to last a lifetime, "you've just admitted to federal crimes, including wiretapping, electronic surveillance, and violation of privacy laws. I strongly advise you to remain silent and contact an attorney immediately." But Karen was beyond the reach of good advice, driven by the kind of panic that makes people say and do things that ensure their own destruction. That's when Patricia delivered what I would later think of as the knockout punch that ended Karen's reign of terror forever. "Miss Whitmore, I need to inform you that you've been under federal investigation for the past 6 months as part of a statewide probe into HOA corruption and abuse of power. This entire situation today was essentially a controlled operation designed to document your methods and gather evidence of your criminal activities." The silence that followed this revelation was so complete, it felt like the world had stopped spinning on its axis. Karen's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious, cycling from confusion to disbelief to the kind of dawning horror that comes with understanding you've been completely outmaneuvered. "That's impossible," she whispered. But the fight had gone out of her voice entirely. "You can't have been investigating me. I would have known. I'm careful about everything I do." The delusion was breathtaking. Someone who had spent months committing federal crimes while believing she was untouchable. "Miss Whitmore, you made our investigation remarkably easy," Patricia continued with the clinical detachment of someone presenting evidence in court. "Your pattern of harassment, illegal surveillance, and financial irregularities flagged our attention 8 months ago when the Martinez family filed a federal complaint. Mason's situation today simply provided us with the final evidence we needed to complete our case." I stared at my laptop screen in amazement, realizing that I had been an unwitting participant in a federal sting operation. But the most devastating revelation was still coming. The information that would explain why Patricia had been so interested in observing this encounter. "We have evidence that you've embezzled approximately $2.3 million from HOA funds over the past 3 years using fraudulent management contracts and fictitious maintenance expenses to cover personal debts and family expenses." Karen's face went completely white as the full scope of her legal exposure became clear to everyone in the room. "The USB drive you're holding," Patricia continued with surgical precision, "contains your complete financial records, email communications with co-conspirators, and detailed plans for expanding your fraudulent operations to other properties in the county. You've essentially been carrying around the evidence that will convict you." Karen looked down at the device in her hands like it had suddenly transformed into a venomous snake, finally understanding that her evidence against me was actually her digital confession. Marcus stepped forward with his handcuffs ready, his voice taking on the formal tone that meant the situation had moved beyond warnings and into actual arrests. "Karen Whitmore, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, stalking, illegal surveillance, and violation of civil rights under color of authority. You have the right to remain silent." As the Miranda rights echoed through my grandfather's cabin, I watched the woman who had terrorized an entire neighborhood finally face the consequences of her actions. But even as Marcus placed the handcuffs on her wrists, Karen managed one last desperate attempt to maintain control of the narrative. You think you've won, she said, looking directly at me with the kind of hatred that comes from someone whose entire identity has been stripped away. But this is bigger than just me. There are others involved, people with real power who won't let this investigation destroy everything we've built. The threat was clear, but it was also the final piece of evidence Patricia needed to expand her investigation beyond just Karen. Thank you for that information, Miss Whitmore, Patricia said with obvious satisfaction. You've just confirmed the existence of the broader conspiracy we've been investigating. Your cooperation, voluntary or otherwise, will be invaluable in identifying your co-conspirators. As Marcus led Karen toward his patrol car, I realized that this morning had become the beginning of something much larger than just one woman's downfall. It was the start of a systemic investigation that would reshape HOA oversight throughout the entire state. 3 weeks after Karen's spectacular downfall in my grandfather's cabin, I sat in the same wooden chair with my morning coffee, reading headlines that still felt surreal. State Attorney General dismantles largest HOA corruption network in state history. The newspaper was spread across the desk Grandpa had built with his own hands, and I could almost hear his voice saying, "I told you so about standing up to bullies." The cabin felt different now, not just because it was finally peaceful, but because it had become something bigger than a family retreat. It had become ground zero for the most significant HOA reform movement in our state's history. The legal aftermath had been swift and devastating for Karen and her network of co-conspirators. Karen herself had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, though her cooperation in identifying other corrupt officials had resulted in a reduction to 8 years with the possibility of parole in 5. I'd written a letter to the judge asking for consideration of her family's circumstances, not because I forgave her actions, but because I understood that desperation could drive people to make terrible choices. The judge had mentioned my letter during sentencing, calling it an example of the grace that separates justice from revenge. 12 other officials had been arrested in the expanding investigation that Patricia's team had dubbed Operation Clean Sweep. The network had been more extensive than anyone imagined, involving county commissioners, building inspectors, and HOA presidents across 6 different communities. The total amount of embezzled funds exceeded $8.7 million. Money that had been systematically stolen from homeowners who thought they were paying for community improvements and professional management. The scope of the corruption was staggering, but so was the swift action that followed once Patricia had the evidence she needed. The most satisfying part of the entire aftermath was watching the families that Karen had terrorized get their lives back. The Johnsons returned to the neighborhood and successfully sued for damages related to their forced sale. The Martinez family, whose federal complaint had started the entire investigation, received a settlement that allowed them to buy a larger home in a better neighborhood. Mr. Martinez hung their unauthorized gnome on Karen's old office, now our legal aid center. The elderly Kowalskis decided to stay in their new retirement community, but they received compensation that ensured their golden years would be financially secure despite Karen's harassment. But the changes went far beyond individual justice. They represented a fundamental shift in how HOAs would operate throughout the state. Patricia had invited me to join the state HOA Reform Commission as a senior advisor, a position that allowed me to help craft legislation preventing future abuse while protecting legitimate community interests. The irony wasn't lost on me that Karen's harassment had inadvertently launched my second career as a consumer protection advocate, turning her victim into her worst nightmare. The transformation of my property had been equally dramatic and meaningful. Using my newfound legal ownership of 40% of what used to be Pinewood Estates, I had worked with the community to establish the Reed Community Legal Aid Center in an expanded version of my grandfather's cabin. The center provided free legal assistance to homeowners facing HOA abuse, funded by a combination of settlement money from the corruption cases and donations from people who had heard our story. Marcus had been promoted to sheriff partly based on his handling of the Karen situation, and he served on our advisory board. Mrs. Rodriguez, the neighbor whose call had brought Marcus to my cabin that fateful morning, had been elected as the new president of the reformed Pinewood Estates HOA. Her first act was to establish a homeowner bill of rights that protected residents from the kind of arbitrary enforcement that had characterized Karen's reign of terror. The community that had once lived in fear of violating obscure rules now thrived under transparent governance and genuine democratic participation. The personal letters I'd received had been overwhelming in both number and emotional impact. Over 400 families had written to share their own HOA horror stories and to thank me for fighting back when they couldn't. Each letter reminded me that Karen's story wasn't unique. It was part of a broader pattern of abuse that happened when people gained power without accountability. Reading those letters had convinced me that my grandfather's cabin needed to become something bigger than a private retreat. It needed to be a symbol of resistance against institutional bullying. The legal center had already handled over 60 cases in its first month of operation, helping homeowners understand their rights, challenging illegal fines, and documenting abuse for potential criminal prosecution. Patricia's office had established a hotline for HOA abuse reports, and the number of cases was staggering. What had seemed like isolated incidents of bad governance turned out to be a systematic problem affecting thousands of families across the state. One of the most unexpected developments was the relationship that developed between Patricia and me as we worked on reform legislation. Our shared commitment to preventing future abuse had evolved into a deep professional partnership and, if I was being honest, something that might become personal as well. She had admitted that watching me handle Karen's harassment with dignity and intelligence had impressed her far more than any traditional job interview could have. And our collaboration on HOA reform had given us countless opportunities to discover how well we worked together. The final twist in this story came just last week when I received a letter from Karen herself, written from federal prison. She had asked me to visit her, claiming she wanted to apologize and explain her actions. I hadn't decided whether to accept her invitation, but the letter had reminded me that even the worst bullies are human beings who make terrible choices for complex reasons. Understanding those reasons might be important for preventing future cases like hers. Standing in my grandfather's cabin, now expanded into a symbol of community justice, I looked at his photograph on the wall and smiled. "You taught me that sometimes you have to stand up and fight, Grandpa. Now I understand what you meant." The cabin had become more than a family legacy. It had become a beacon for anyone facing the kind of institutional bullying that thrives in darkness, but crumbles when exposed to light. Karen's attempt to destroy my peace had instead created something beautiful, a place where justice wasn't just an abstract concept, but a daily practice of protecting the vulnerable from those who abuse their power. Karen thought her title made her untouchable. But one recording, one stand unraveled her whole empire. Your story could be next. Comment your HOA horror below. We're fighting back together. Whether it's an HOA president, a difficult boss, or any bully who thinks they're untouchable, this story proves that standing up for what's right, even when you're scared, can create change bigger than you ever imagine. Your voice matters, and your story could inspire someone else to find their courage. If this resonated with you, give us a like and subscribe to HOA Unfiltered, because every story of justice deserves to be heard and shared. Appreciate you being here with HOA Unfiltered. Some folks think HOA conflicts are just petty neighbor disputes, but they can shake entire communities. We share the real dramas to remind everyone titles don't give you power. Truth does. If you face injustice behind gated communities, you are not alone. Drop your thoughts below and join the resistance. One story at a time. We are leveling the playing field.